Hello and welcome. This is Talk Giving to Me, Segal Family Foundation's live podcast featuring conversations with fellow funders. My name is Sylvia Ilahuka, and I work with Segal Family Foundation, an award-winning social impact funder and advisor championing local African organizations and supporting progressive donors to do the same. Today, I'm in Lusaka, Zambia, and about to be in conversation with Anna Holmström, Deputy Country Representative for UNFPA, the UN's Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. We are also joined by Ms. Mbewe-Anamela, the Executive Director of the Non-Government Organization Coordinating Council here in Zambia. Thank you for joining us, Anna and Anne. I would like to have a conversation today about the changing funding landscape in the wake of the USAID dismantling and other shifts in global development funding. Here in Africa, the impacts have been particularly felt, as in other countries in the global south. And I would love to hear from your experience with your various agencies and CSOs on the ground, what that has actually looked like and what funders could be doing better going forward. For now, I would like to hear what the impact of the USAID dismantling has looked like on the ground among the CSOs. Let's hear from you, Anne.
We have some of our member organizations actually that are really struggling now, and that's because of the sudden, the sudden way in which some of the funding was withdrawn, particularly the American funding, and we also have seen a shift with even the other funders ever since the American funding was withdrawn. Understandably so. I think there are other issues that have necessitated this shift. We've seen a lot of funders now coming away from some of the social funding and into infrastructure and economic development. And while most of the organizations, for instance, that we work with are gender focused and more social. So we've been hit. I think the organizations like the ones we support have been hit from two perspectives. One is the withdrawal of U.S. funding. Some were directly funded by U.S., but also some of the changing global context that had even started before this happened, but I think have been they've forced more changes even with the traditional donors around looking at doing things differently, and that really we've seen the impact with our member organizations.
So last year, Segal Family Foundation, we wrote an article about how to avoid the cycle of panic that comes up every time there's a huge shift in the global funding landscape. It's like there's panic and scrambling to pick up the pieces and figure out a way forward. And after a couple of years, there's inevitably another crisis of some sort, usually rooted in the West, that has ripple effects in the South. And part of our suggestion for avoiding those cycles of panic is, first of all, donors approaching funding differently in supporting organizations, being more direct about funding, being more geared towards localization and really like meeting organizations on the ground where they are. I would like to hear from Anna in particular. What could donor entities be doing better to bridge this current gap and any other gaps that may come down the line?
So one of the things that we've been discussing heavily is the fact that we need to stop doing business as usual. So, for example, if a ministry normally has a policy for one thing and an implementation plan for another and a strategy for a sub-thematic group. So, for example, if there's a sexual and reproductive health policy and an adolescent reproductive health strategy and a fistula roadmap and all of these things, and maybe one development is $25,000, including the validation and so forth. Should we look at maybe having one policy document that encompasses everything and have one process of developing that, validating that, and then use more money towards the service provision and where the impact is? And then I think the other thing is coordination. And coordination became also critical when the funding gaps started appearing, because suddenly there were all these new entities that were funded externally coming in and saying, "Ooh, we've just received funding to do a mapping of the fiscal space for this commodity or this." And suddenly we had all these external entities coming in to kind of stopgap where that money should have gone to the local entities and actually to address the gaps rather than doing maybe, we had probably like 2 requests for interviews per week from different entities that were there to now respond to the crisis. So I think coordination is key. I think territorialism between agencies needs to stop, and I think there's a lot of room for efficiencies generally.
So for larger agencies like the UN and organizations, or rather donors, for whom being able to adapt quickly to changes is, by virtue of their size and bureaucracy and how they function internally, sometimes not very possible. What does that look like? How can they not be doing business as usual, as you put it, in order to respond quicker to changes on the ground?
I think as long as at the level of management there is a will, then there is a way. And I think because of different funding modalities that have been put in place, as long as you know the structures, it's doable. There's but there needs to be a common understanding of the need to do something. So for example, as UNFPA, we have implementing partners who implement and who are long-term agreement holders, but then we have small grant making facilities. And if you work hard, you can get those monies off the ground within 2 weeks easily. And but the flexibility is there only when it comes to core funding. And most of our funding now is earmarked in projects that have indicators that are often externally derived.
I see.
So I think the importance of core funding for agencies like Anne, but also for UN agencies, that's where it needs to be, because then they can be locally reprogrammed when needs change. And they are changing. They are changing when a drought comes. They are changing when the government in the US changed. And there's, with climate change and the geopolitical tensions that are there currently, we're only going to be seeing more of that.
Thank you so much for that. I'm definitely a big proponent for unrestricted, multi-year flexible funding, because that makes it possible for implementing orgs to actually do what they need to do, keep the lights on. And I can speak a little bit from the philanthropy world, where we're seeing private donors who want to give money to local organizations, looking for ways to get that money directly in the hands of the orgs, but facing obstacles where, they're resource rich, but infrastructurally poor. You may have the money, but not want to set up a foundation of your own and now start figuring out the logistics of sending money and whatnot. So we're seeing a lot more collaboration, which you were talking about earlier, between donors coming together and saying, okay, let's pool our money and fund as a coalition, and actually also fund coalitions of organizations. Or let's put our money in a donor advised fund. Like we have one now, it's called the Multiplier. And we basically receive money from individuals or other entities who want to fund partner organizations, but they don't really know how to do so. They don't want to deal with it. And then we figure that part out. So there are definitely creative ways to adapt funding modalities to make sure money can get where it needs to get quickly. Anne, please tell us how you're thinking, or your views on sustainability for civil society orgs and other implementers in countries.
I think one of the things that we would like to see around flexible funding is the willingness to support social enterprise. We, for instance, as NGOCC, have come to realization that these cyclical shocks that you spoke about will always be with us. So how do we prepare ourselves? And the best way to do that is to try and ensure that we have our own sources of income. And the only way we can do this, because we're not profit-making institutions, but is to have social enterprises. For example, we could have a cooperative. We have a cooperative which we've established, but the thing is, even for that, you need some seed money, and most funding agencies do not want to fund social enterprise. And when we talk about social enterprise, whatever returns we get from whatever business we might do, will go back into our programming and sustain our programming. And that is the type of flexibility that would, like, even as an umbrella organization, we've been encouraging our member organizations to look at social enterprise, and some of them are responding very well. So that is the type of flexibility I think that would be very, very helpful to us right now. That seed funding, just to establish some social enterprise and reduce our almost 100% dependency.
Yeah. So in Africa, and I think broadly over the global south, civil society organizations are often filling in for government on services that should be provided by the state or by the country. And, communities have come together to say, okay, we need this thing. It's not being provided. Let us start an organization and do this, solve this problem, which is great. Local solutions for local problems, always a good thing.
Yes.
However, long term, what does that look like for governments, for the communities themselves, in terms of accountability, because these are things that should be provided for, but they're not. And then, again, overarching the theme of sustainability.
Well, I think the one question that sometimes arises when, with that type of a scenario is, should governments also be supporting civil society? Because we do step in, where they have gaps in their service delivery and all. But whenever that question comes up again, there's the question of, if they do, to what extent are you going to have the voice to hold them to account? Because you might begin to think you are obligated to be nice in order to, to continue to get funding. So sustainability, it would be good if government, recognizing the role that civil society played, was able to fund civil society. But then again, we must be, I think, very conscious of the fact that we must remain neutral, and we must remain, with a voice that can speak around ensuring that we're holding government to account, especially if you talk about governance, civil society organizations. So I think it gets back to something that Anna said. There are certain critical areas, especially around social development, that government must cease to depend on external financing, such as the distribution of drugs. So they need to relook at the budgeting and the allocation of resources when it comes to national budgets, to ensure that the critical areas for sustainability remain well funded. But it's a question of choice. It's a question of political will. And it's also a question of understanding what is critical. So I think we need conversations, that look at yes, we're here to help, but this is a stopgap measure while you put your house in order and determine what is essential for you to always include in your budgets as a government. I think those conversations must be held and must be very, very, very candid. We as a country, there are certain areas where we should have reached. For instance, the regional norm, I think, is it the global acceptable percentage of financing to, is it health, is 15% of the national budget? We haven't reached there yet. So where is the commitment? So we really need to identify the very, very critical areas and ensure that government funds those resources.
So we have two interesting cases in our portfolio of CSOs that have covered a gap, but in turn been recognized by the government for that service that they're providing and received support towards the same. One of them is in Rwanda. Their name is Solid Africa. And what they do is feed patients in hospitals. It's nutrition support for patients in hospitals, some of the government hospitals. They cook food, they feed them. The government said, hey, you know what? You're actually doing a good thing. Thank you so much. Here, do your things well. And they provided support to, make it easier for them to do what they do. That is rare, quite honestly, on the continent. But we also have an interesting one here in Zambia called Healthy Learners. Are you familiar with them? Yes. So Healthy Learners, they support schools, kind of have that connection between schools and health facilities to make sure learners are not missing education opportunities. How does UNFPA as an agency support that link between CSOs and government, if at all?
Significantly. So, for example, during the drought, we supported Ministry of Health to conduct mobile clinics because we found that women stopped going to deliver because they were using the deliver at facilities, or they stopped going to family planning. We had more cases of child marriage being reported to our toll-free helpline. And so we supported our community organizations to inform communities that Ministry of Health will have a mobile clinic at this and this place at this and this time. And then we reached over 300,000 drought-affected people with SRH, GPV, and HIV clinics. Civil society was supported to set up the grievance mechanism for the drought response. They had 22,000 calls related to community members being asked for kickbacks in return for being put on the food and cash lists. Data that was really useful then for the disaster management unit. The disaster management unit of the government started getting protection-related cases. So with UNICEF, we stepped in and got the toll-free helpline to put 2 child protection specialists in the government help center from the CSO, now working at a government call center. I think going back to your question about the role of civil society and what should be the government, what should the government be doing? One of the key things that we're supporting CSOs to do is budget tracking and budget advocacy, and especially budget tracking on SRH. And but one of the things that we found is that there's 3 other consortia doing exactly the same thing. So again, it's a critique to ourselves that we need to do one thing and collectively as civil society. And then that advocacy leads to increased domestic financing for the things that the civil society wants to see. And Zambia is one of the best performing in terms of that. The government has committed 7.2 million for SRH commodities this year and 4 million for distribution of the commodities this year. One of the discussions that we've had with Ministry of Finance is the fact that one of the things that isn't in the health system nor the police system is the comprehensive GPV services, which were significantly impacted by the USAID cuts. I think they were the biggest funder, the Stop GPV. So our one-stop centers are paralyzed because they were dependent on donor funding. So now the discussion is, how do we start creating government-financed GPV services where they've always been donor funded? And one of the superintendents from St. Francis, or the superintendent of St. Francis Hospital, went to look at the one-stop centers that are there. He visited 31 of them. Only 1 was functioning at the moment. So the GPV services are currently, I would say, paralyzed. So I think that's a key area where systems need to actually be completely created, where this has been like a donor darling in the past, because we need to accept that it's an essential service as much as other services. But we take pride in not only creating links between civil society and government, but also the faith-based organizations. And we're looking more and more with the faith-based organizations on how they can use their systems to reach people at scale. So we're working, for example, now with the Catholic Church on a grievance mechanism for the coming elections, so that they create the demand, the civil society answers the calls, and then the government responds. So we have National Prosecution Authority, police, and others. So it's what we do best.
So in your vast experience and from the perspective of the organizations under the NGOCC, what would you say is the biggest obstacle in getting a government to commit to putting funding towards a certain system change or project or whatever it is, just getting the government to commit funding? What's the biggest obstacle?
I think the biggest obstacle is whether government really does see us as partners in development. They say they do, but there's the times when we feel or we perceive that they actually might not really appreciate the other role that we play, and that is around holding them to account. So I think that's a factor around, yes, civil society do a good job, but then they call us out when we, when anything goes wrong. So I think that's the catch-22 there.
Yeah.
But, there are certain, for example, we have the YWCA. There are certain organizations that really do a fantastic job, and YWCA is a member of NGOCC, do a fantastic job when it comes to issues around GBV. They actually run shelters for women and girls. So a government should really look at what has happened now with the funding, and then determine that this NGO actually has been doing a good job. This is our role as government to do this, and maybe we should fund them. When you talked about the example that you gave in Rwanda, my first thought was YWCA. and that role that they play. GBV is a big issue in Zambia, and we have an anti-GBV Act which compels the government to set up a GBV fund, which they have not done. So why not set it up and give it to an institution like YWCA?
Those are the deeper questions, which if we get into those questions, we might be in hairy territory. Okay. Yeah, this has been really enriching. I have so many things swirling in my head, but we might have to continue the conversation another day. For now, I'm really grateful for your time and your expertise and sharing all of your insights into the changing funding landscape. And I wish you both the very best in all that you do. We shall meet next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.